You are watching an OraCloud Plus Training as a Service video snippet. Snippets are concise, targeted tutorials explaining how to use, configure, integrate, deploy, and support Oracle's Fusion Cloud applications. Snippets are delivered via FAST, the Fusion Application Support Tool. FAST is accessible via the web at www.oracloud.plus. No more watching hours of learning path style videos to get to the 5-minute snippet you need. Learn Oracle's Fusion Cloud applications in minutes, not hours. Hello, and welcome to the Fusion versus PeopleSoft Supplier Management Comparison video. This video is intended for existing PeopleSoft eSupplier Connection licensees looking for comparison versus Fusion's suppliers application, or what's also called a functional work area. Please note that Fusion is often referred to as Fusion Cloud Application and/or Oracle Cloud in the marketplace. For the purposes of this conversation, they are one and the same. This video highlights the differences between Fusion's supplier functionality and PeopleSoft's supplier functionality. Okay, so key comparison areas will be as follows. First, Supplier Business Unit Access. Next, Supplier Communication. Third, the ease of contact or supplier contact management. Fourth, supplier bidder history. Next, business classification management. And then lastly, supplier search capabilities. Okay, so let's jump in. First up, supplier BU access. So in PeopleSoft, supplier exposure was driven by what's called a set ID. So for a different business unit or a given business unit, each of the different types of records, account, department, product, supplier, would point to a set of data. And so the concept is really set of data driven. So that's how you assigned your access. However, in Fusion, it's a little bit more flexible than a monolithic set ID. In Fusion, each supplier at the site level, right? So not a global supplier belongs to set ID belongs to business unit. Really, at the supplier, I can have a global supplier with, in this case, a US, a Mexican, a Canadian, a European site, and I could expose that supplier, or in effect, those supplier sites, which is the profile of the suppliers plus some additional profile-ish type information. And I can expose it to the US, to the Mexican, to the Canadian, the European site collectively, or I can segregate them like you see here. So just a little bit more flexibility being site-driven as opposed to set ID-driven like PeopleSoft is. Next up, supplier communication. Okay, so you can see here on the top left, this is more of external communication. So what you see in the upper left is a message as part of the negotiation or sourcing application. And this is external communication. So my procurement org is communicating via instant message functionality to my supplier. So A, it's there. B, it's not difficult to set up like it was in PeopleSoft. So it's a little bit easier in Fusion, or really what we call out of the box, where I can communicate externally. Now there's a little bit of a limitation. I'd like to see that being ongoing and I could use it at any time. It's really specific more to the negotiation, but it certainly is a nice upgrade in terms of functionality. We draw your eyes a little bit here to the right. Well, now we see Oracle Social Network, and that's an internal tool that replaces something like email. And what it really allows us to do at this moment is it allows us to attach different conversation or documents around a given supplier. So if I had a supplier and I wanted to store some information about my experience, or I wanted to create an approval group and store information around the approval of the supplier, again, all internally to our organization, then I could do that using OSN. So this is just a little bit of the internal and external communication advantages, if you will, of Fusion versus PeopleSoft. Next up, ease of contact management. So contacts are simply the users for the supplier. So on the left, you can see a picture of Fusion, and you can see all of the suppliers. Really no different than PeopleSoft. PeopleSoft has contacts. I believe they have a separate tab, just like it does for location, in the supplier setup. However, when you get into Fusion, you have a lot more flexibility with what would be more the security end of what PeopleSoft determines about roles, role access, which suppliers they have access to or do not have access, whether the supplier account is active or inactive, the ability to reset the password. So all kind of what you see here in the image on the right. But again, it's really empowering the business user to control this as opposed to having to go to IT to deal with roles, or IT to deal with reset the password, or IT to add another supplier, etc. So again, empowering the user. So I think that's a little bit better in Fusion in terms of the ease of contact management. Number 4, supplier bidder history. This is a big one. And I think this is a departure both from EBS as well as PeopleSoft when you get into Fusion, and maybe a few other applications. So historically, these were two different records. If you want to talk specifically about PeopleSoft, if I had a bidder, that bidder would in effect get inactivated when it was changed, grown up, promoted to, which is a Fusion term, a spend authorized supplier. So there was a bidder, it got deactivated when it became a supplier in PeopleSoft. Hence, you lost all that visibility and data. And there was some other confusion as well around the supplier record, having multiple suppliers or bidders. So what we see now in terms of Fusion is that these records are unified, meaning that it's the same record, it has a different classification. It's either prospective, meaning bidder, or spend authorized, meaning full-blown supplier. And so that way, when I do sourcing, as you can see on the image to the left, that particular supplier is spend authorized. But you can see sourcing invitations with the red ellipse around it has 8. Those sourcing invitations could have very well been when the supplier was a prospective supplier, or what's called a bidder. So it's a little bit of that history. So remember, we're termed bidder supplier history in this particular comparison, that we don't lose all of our history when our bidder becomes a supplier. So I think that's a little bit better in Fusion as well. And so it just allows us to keep that history, which is what you see here. Okay, so number 5, business classification management. All right, so this is something that's really nice. What we can do with business classifications is we can store what PeopleSoft called government certs, I think. It was on the identifying information tab, and it really lacked a lot of the data, not a lot, but some of the data that we needed, a start date and end date. It lacked the ability to be self-service in a portal. It lacked the ability to be auto-renewed, to have workflow associated with it. So when you get from PeopleSoft into Fusion with business classifications, or let's think of them in 2 important areas that you'll see a lot: supplier diversity management of the certs, and then insurance for services suppliers. So it's not just that the profiles capture business classifications, but they show visibility to those in the sourcing process, in the search process, etc. You also can drive expiration notification. So I can use tools like an initiative to ask a converted supplier to complete a question of which the container for the answer to that question, what is your, or are you hub zone certified, can be stored against the supplier in a business classification. And through this expiration, I can have that to be managed and notified and escalated to me if not managed, meaning if it expires, that the supplier through the portal can manage this information. So it's not just about the additional supplier information, it's how all these tools are working together to further the degree of self-service. And then lastly, if you, Mr. and Mrs. Supplier, manage your business classifications, then when we ask for those sourcing or those requirements as part of sourcing in templates, meaning we don't have to add it every time, well, you don't have to add it every time either because you've kept your profile current. So you'll hear us talk a lot about integrated data model, and that just simply means the questions that we're answering in an initiative get a data value, put it against a supplier, like you see here, may or may not have a change request to get the information approved, again, integration, may or may not be used by a sourcing event to leverage that you've already put the data in there and we don't need you to ask or provide this classification every time. So it's just a little bit about business classifications and how, quite frankly, they're a little bit better in Fusion than they were in PeopleSoft. Okay, so last up, supplier search capabilities. So one of the things that's nice is that at several points in the application, so two notable points, one, to search the supply base so I can see who has this local preference qualification, if you will. So that supplier search based on those variables, which is what you see in the image on the left. Several different places in the application you can perform research, and business classification is one of them, but there's lots of different vectors or attributes that you can search through suppliers on. One of the other nice parts about this is at a lot of different points, and so you see it here in research, but it's also in sourcing. When you look at this image across the bottom where it says Lee Supplies, you see automatically that it's pulling data from all the different transactions. This is in research, but you could also look at that same transaction level detail within the sourcing event. And so this kind of ubiquitous approach to the same data being visible in multiple places, it's just kind of what we'd expect as we rewrite these applications with a little bit tighter integration, and they evolve. So that's a little bit about how the research of suppliers is better in Fusion, or a little bit more advanced and integrated than it was in PeopleSoft. Okay, so that's the end for this comparison video. There's obviously more points that we could have addressed, but these are 6 areas where we feel like Fusion is really accelerating versus legacy apps, or in this case, specifically versus PeopleSoft. So hopefully that provides you with some information, and thank you for watching.